There are television shows that entertain you, and then there are television shows that leave a permanent mark on the cultural fabric of an entire generation. Married with Children was undeniably the latter. For 11 seasons, from 1987 to 1997, America tuned in every week to watch the Bundy family stumble, bicker, insult, and somehow survive the beautiful disaster that was their life on June Street in Chicago. Al Bundy became one of the most recognizable characters in the history of American television. A man so perfectly miserable, so completely defeated by the mundane weight of ordinary life, that audiences could not look away. They laughed at him, they laughed with him, and deep down, many of them recognized something painfully familiar in his slouched posture and thousand-yard stare. But behind every iconic character is a real human being carrying weight that the audience never sees. Ed O'Neill, the man who brought Al Bundy to life with such devastating authenticity, has spent decades carefully guarding the fuller story of what those 11 years truly cost him, what happened behind the cameras, and what he came to understand about himself, the show, and the people he worked alongside only long after the studio lights had gone dark for the final time. Now, piecing together years of candid interviews, retrospective conversations, and reflective moments O'Neill has shared publicly, a far richer and more complex picture of Married with Children begins to emerge. A picture that most fans, even the most devoted ones, never fully understood. To understand what Married with Children meant to Ed O'Neill, you first have to understand who Ed O'Neill was before the show ever existed. Born in Youngstown, Ohio in 1946, O'Neill grew up in a working-class environment that would later prove to be the deepest well he drew from when constructing Al Bundy. Youngstown in those decades was a steel and manufacturing town, a place where men went to work in factories and came home exhausted, where dignity was measured in endurance rather than ambition, and where the gap between the American dream and American reality was something everyone quietly understood, but nobody talked about directly. O'Neill watched those men, his father, his uncles, the neighbors. He absorbed the particular way exhaustion settles into a person's body after years of grinding labor, the way a man's shoulders drop, the way his eyes lose a certain brightness not all at once, but gradually, like a light being slowly dimmed. He filed all of it away without knowing he was doing it, the way certain observations sink into a person long before they find their purpose. Before Married with Children came along, O'Neill had pursued acting with genuine seriousness. He trained, he worked in theater, and he even had a brief stint with the Pittsburgh Steelers before injuries redirected his path. He chased roles in New York and eventually made his way to Los Angeles, accumulating small film and television credits without ever landing the defining breakthrough. By the time he walked into the audition room for Married with Children in 1986, he was 40 years old, hardly the profile of a rising star. What he had instead was something rarer and harder to manufacture. He had lived enough life to know exactly what defeat looked like from the inside. That authenticity was everything. When the show's creators, Michael Moy and Ron Levitt, watched O'Neill audition, they reportedly recognized immediately that he wasn't performing Al Bundy so much as channeling something deeply genuine. The exhaustion was real. The resignation was real. And that reality is precisely what made Al Bundy land with audiences in a way that no polished Hollywood performance ever could have replicated. Most people who grew up watching Married with Children have no idea how close the show came to never existing at all, or how radically different it might have looked had certain decisions gone another way. Fox Broadcasting, which launched formally in 1986, was a network that the entertainment establishment largely treated as a joke. The three major networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, had decades of infrastructure, prestige, and audience loyalty. Fox had ambition, a handful of affiliates, and a very limited track record. They needed programming that would make noise, something that would force people to pay attention. Married with Children, based on its premise alone, was a genuine gamble. The concept of an anti-family sitcom, one that deliberately subverted the warm, aspirational domestic imagery that shows like The Cosby Show were delivering to enormous rating success, was either going to resonate as sharp cultural satire or collapse as mean-spirited and unwatchable. There was very little middle ground. Network executives were nervous. Some reportedly pushed for a more conventional approach, softening the edges, making the Bundys less abrasive. Moy and Levitt resisted those pressures, insisting that the entire premise depended on honesty and that sanitizing it would destroy the very thing that made it work. Ed O'Neill has reflected in interviews over the years on how acutely aware he was of those stakes when the show first began. He understood that Fox needed Married with Children to succeed in a way that went beyond ordinary ratings pressure. If the show failed badly enough, it could genuinely damage the network's credibility at a moment when that credibility was still being established. That awareness added a layer of pressure to the early seasons that most cast members carried quietly without ever fully voicing it on set. What fans also rarely consider is how unusual the show's creative philosophy was for its era. Television in the late 1980s was still largely governed by an unspoken agreement that family programming should be aspirational. Families on television might face problems, but they solved them. They grew. They learned. The sitcom format was in many ways a weekly ritual of reassurance. Married with Children demolished that agreement deliberately and completely. The Bundys didn't grow. AL's dreams didn't come true. The problems didn't get solved. And somehow, in that refusal to offer false comfort, the show told a more honest story about the texture of ordinary American life than almost anything else on television at the time. Here is something Ed O'Neill has touched on in various interviews across the decades, something that fans tend to underestimate because it sounds like an actor's complaint rather than a genuine psychological reality. Playing Al Bundy for 11 years was not simply a matter of showing up and reciting cynical lines. It required O'Neill to inhabit a specific emotional state, one characterized by resignation, low-grade bitterness, and a kind of performative hopelessness, week after week, season after season. That is not a neutral experience for a human being to sustain. O'Neill has spoken about the strange blurring that can occur when a role is demanding enough and sustained long enough. Not confusion about who you actually are, but a kind of emotional residue that follows you off set. When you spend your working hours channeling defeat, when your job requires you to embody a man who has abandoned any real expectation of happiness or fulfillment, that weight has somewhere to go when the cameras stop rolling. O'Neill found himself in the unusual position of having to actively shake off Al Bundy's psychological signature at the end of each workday, a process that became more conscious and more effortful as the years accumulated. There is also the physical dimension that fans rarely appreciate. Al Bundy was not a character who simply sat in a chair and delivered one-liners, though that image of him sunken into the couch with his hand in his pants became iconic. The show involved consistent physical comedy, slapstick sequences, pratfalls, and the particular physical demands that live audience filming imposes. Every episode was performed essentially as a stage play in front of several hundred people, meaning that energy had to be sustained at a performance pitch for hours at a time. O'Neill was doing this while also managing the back problems that accumulated over the years, pushing through physical discomfort because the show's schedule left no meaningful room for recovery. Interviewed years after the show ended, O'Neill acknowledged that he didn't take particularly good care of himself during those 11 years. The work consumed priority over everything else. And while he's spoken about those years with genuine affection and humor, there's a thread of honest reckoning in his reflections that acknowledges the cost more directly than he might have been willing to do while the show was still running. One of the most fascinating and least discussed aspects of Married with Children's history is the fact that the cast audiences came to love was not the original cast. The pilot episode featured different actors in the roles of Kelly and Bud Bundy, and that fact alone reframes everything about how the show's famous ensemble chemistry is understood. The original pilot featured Tina Caspary and Hunter Carson in the roles that would eventually be inhabited by Christina Applegate and David Faustino. By most accounts, the pilot simply didn't work the way the creative team needed it to. The specific alchemy of this kind of ensemble comedy is extraordinarily difficult to manufacture artificially. You either have it or you don't, and recasting is a blunt and sometimes devastating instrument for trying to find it. Christina Applegate has spoken in interviews about what it meant to step into Kelly Bundy at 15 years old. She was a young actor who had appeared in various television projects, but Married with Children was a different scale of challenge entirely. Kelly Bundy was a character that required a very precise balance. Too much, and she became a caricature. Too little, and she disappeared into the background of AL's story. Applegate found that balance with what appears to have been instinctive confidence, delivering a performance that was simultaneously broad enough for broad comedy and grounded enough to generate real feeling. David Faustino brought something similarly specific to Bud. The character could easily have been a simple foil, a straight man to AL's dysfunction. Instead, Faustino gave Bud his own complex relationship to the Bundy family's chaos, simultaneously embarrassed by and deeply shaped by it, striving constantly for a status and dignity that the family's circumstances perpetually undercut. That specificity is what made Bud funny in a way that went beyond the obvious jokes. O'Neill has reflected on the difference those castings made, acknowledging that the ensemble that emerged from those decisions was genuinely irreplaceable. Katie Sagal as Peg Bundy is perhaps the most underappreciated performance in the entire show's run. Peg is a character who could have been simply a nagging wife, a stock figure from the oldest traditions of domestic comedy. Instead, Sagal made her sharp, sometimes startlingly insightful, and capable of genuine feeling beneath the surface performance of cheerful indifference. Her chemistry with O'Neill generated the specific electricity that the show ran on, a dynamic that felt simultaneously like genuine antagonism and genuine love without either element ever being stated directly. In 1989, Married with Children became the target of an organized advertiser boycott that sent genuine shockwaves through Fox Broadcasting and created a crisis atmosphere within the production. The boycott, led by a Michigan woman named Terry Ricalta, who had written directly to the show's advertisers after finding an episode offensive, resulted in several major corporations pulling their advertising from the program. The business implications were real and immediate, particularly for a network that was still establishing its financial footing. What happened next is one of the most instructive stories in American television history. Fox faced a genuine decision point. They could respond to the pressure by moderating the show's content, pulling back from its more provocative edges, and attempting to reassure advertisers that Married with Children was a responsible property. Or they could hold firm and accept the commercial consequences. The decision to hold firm, combined with the enormous media coverage that the boycott itself generated, produced an outcome that nobody had calculated in advance. Millions of Americans who had never watched Married with Children became aware of it specifically because of the controversy. They tuned in to see what all the outrage was about. Many of them stayed because what they found was funnier, sharper, and more genuinely satirical than the concerned letters too. Advertisers had suggested. The ratings climbed in ways that more than offset the lost advertising revenue. O'Neill's reflections on that period reveal something nuanced about his understanding of what the show was actually doing. He has been consistent in interviews about the fact that Married with Children was never intended as genuine provocation for its own sake. The writers were satirists, and the Bundy family's dysfunction was always meant as a mirror held up to certain realities of American life, particularly the gap between the cheerful mythology of the nuclear family and the messy, more frustrated reality that many ordinary people actually lived. The controversy, from O'Neill's perspective, partly reflected a discomfort with having that mirror held up directly. The creative response to the boycott pressure was also revealing. Rather than softening the material, the writers became more technically sophisticated in how they delivered it. The blunt provocations gave way to layered jokes that operated on multiple levels simultaneously, surface level enough to pass certain scrutiny while retaining their subversive charge for audiences paying close attention. In that sense, the boycott made the show's writing sharper and more interesting, a paradox that O'Neill has noted with evident appreciation. There are moments in Married with Children's history that most fans encounter only as footnotes, if they encounter them at all, but which cast long shadows over the entire production in ways that the people involved have only described honestly in retrospect. Among the most significant was the personal tragedy that Katie Sagal experienced during the show's sixth season. Sagal had become pregnant, and the production had incorporated her pregnancy into the storyline, building toward a narrative in which Peg Bundy would deliver a new addition to the Bundy household. It was a significant creative decision, one that had implications for the show's entire established dynamic. Then, late in the pregnancy, Sagal lost the baby. The production's response was to rewrite the storyline as a dream sequence, imagining the pregnancy and birth, and then waking to discover it had never happened. From a pure storytelling perspective, it was a solution that preserved continuity. From a human perspective, it required Katie Sagal to return to work still in grief and perform comedy while the tragedy she had just experienced was being processed through the very medium she was performing in. O'Neill has spoken about this period with a candor that reflects genuine retrospective reckoning. He acknowledges that he didn't handle it well, that he defaulted to a kind of professional distance when what the situation actually called for was the willingness to be present with someone in pain. The set culture of Married with Children, like many comedy sets, ran on a particular kind of deflection. Humor was the universal language, and genuine emotional directness could feel like a disruption of the rhythm everyone depended on. O'Neill has recognized, looking back, that this cultural norm served the work at the expense of the people doing it. That reckoning extends to other dimensions of what he calls his failures of attention during the show's run. The pace of production, the relentlessness of the schedule, and the psychological demands of inhabiting Al Bundy created conditions in which it was easy to miss what the people around you actually needed. He has spoken in interviews about arriving at a deeper understanding of those years only once he had sufficient distance from them, recognizing connections and failures that he was simply too close and too busy to see clearly at the time. When Married with Children ended in 1997 after 11 seasons, it ended without ceremony, without a planned finale, and without the kind of deliberate closure that a show of its cultural significance perhaps deserved. The cancellation arrived not as the result of catastrophically failing ratings, but as a business decision within a network landscape that had changed substantially since 1987. Fox had grown from a scrappy insurgent into a genuine major player, and the programming priorities that came with that growth no longer placed Married with Children at the center. The manner in which the show ended, without a designed final episode, without a proper goodbye to its characters or its audience, has remained a source of genuine frustration for O'Neill across the years. He has spoken about it in terms that suggest it felt like an absence rather than a conclusion, as if the story simply stopped rather than ended. For a show that had, for all its irreverence, built a genuine emotional relationship with its audience over more than a decade, that abrupt cessation felt like a failure of respect. Respect for the work, for the people who had done it, and for the viewers who had shown up every week for 11 years. O'Neill has acknowledged that the entertainment industry's transactional nature should have prepared him for exactly this kind of ending, and that on some level he understood intellectually how these things worked. But understanding something intellectually and absorbing it emotionally are different experiences, and the absence of closure left a residue that took years to fully process. Christina Applegate has echoed similar sentiments in her own retrospective interviews, describing the ending as something she and her castmates had to manufacture for themselves because the industry certainly wasn't going to provide it. What strikes observers who have followed O'Neill's career is how thoroughly and thoughtfully he has processed those years in retrospect. The man who played television's most famous cynic has approached his own history with a degree of honest self-examination that Al Bundy will have found completely incomprehensible. That gap between character and actor is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Ed O'Neill's relationship to Married with Children. Decades after its finale, Married with Children occupies a peculiar position in the television canon. It is remembered primarily as a comedy, which it certainly was, but that categorization undersells the specificity and precision of what the show was actually doing during its run. At its best, Married with Children was a piece of sustained social satire that used the conventions of domestic sitcom storytelling to expose the gap between American mythology and American experience. Al Bundy was not simply a joke. He was a portrait of something real and widespread. The particular defeat of a man who had been promised certain things by the culture he lived in and had found those promises to be, at best, aspirational fictions. The American working-class male of Al Bundy's generation had grown up with a clear set of expectations. Work hard, provide for your family, and the rewards would come. What many of them found instead was a more complicated reality in which work was grinding rather than fulfilling. Provision was financial survival rather than comfortable security, and the rewards kept getting pushed further into a future that never quite arrived. The show never stated any of this directly. It didn't need to. It dramatized it with every joke, every sigh, every moment of Al retreating to the toilet as his only available sanctuary. Audiences recognized what they were seeing because many of them were living versions of it themselves, or had fathers or uncles or neighbors who were. The laughter that Married with Children generated was real, but it was the complicated kind of laughter that comes from recognition rather than distance. Ed O'Neill has spoken about coming to this understanding gradually rather than arriving at it fully formed. In the early years of the show, his focus was necessarily on the immediate demands of the performance, making each scene work, finding the rhythm with his castmates, navigating the physical and psychological demands of live audience filming. The larger meaning of what they were collectively doing became clearer in retrospect, as the show's cultural footprint became more visible and as O'Neill himself gained the distance necessary to see it more completely. His subsequent career, particularly the extended run on Modern Family that began in 2009, gave him a specific kind of perspective on Married with Children that the passage of time alone couldn't have provided. Playing Jay Pritchett, a patriarch who was flawed but ultimately loving, who struggled but ultimately connected, who carried his own damage but ultimately grew, gave O'Neill a direct point of comparison. He has described in interviews the experience of realizing just how different those two characters were in their fundamental orientation toward life, and how playing both of them in sequence gave him a richer understanding of each. What Ed O'Neill has ultimately revealed across years of candid reflection is not a simple story of behind-the-scenes drama, though there was drama, or of personal cost, though there was cost. What he has revealed is something more interesting and more human than either of those things. He has revealed the experience of spending 11 years inside something that mattered more than he fully understood while he was doing it, and of spending the years since working backward toward that understanding with honesty and without self-pity. Married with Children worked because it was honest about something that television was largely unwilling to be honest about. Ed O'Neill worked because he brought to that honesty a depth of authentic feeling that no amount of technical skill could have manufactured from scratch. The combination produced something genuinely lasting, a show that still finds new audiences, still generates recognition and laughter, and still carries within its deliberately shabby exterior a portrait of American life that was more truthful than most of its contemporaries were willing to attempt. Al Bundy never got the ending he deserved. The show that carried him didn't quite either. But the work itself, those 11 seasons of carefully observed human comedy, remains exactly what it always was. A reminder that sometimes the most honest thing television can do is refuse to pretend that everything turns out fine. And that in that refusal, if the work is good enough, something genuinely meaningful can take root in the laughter. The fans who watched every week understood something without necessarily being able to articulate it. Ed O'Neill, finally and fully, is helping them find the words.